Our guest today is the United States Congressman from Illinois' 11th Congressional District. He is a scientist and a businessman. Our guest today is the only physicist in Congress. Before being elected to Congress, he worked as a researcher at Fermilab for 23 years. Our guest today earned his Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and graduated from Harvard University with a PhD in physics. He and his wife, Esuk, live in Naperville, and our guest today is the proud father of two grown children, and one of them is here today, Billy, who works over at Kirkland & Ellis, and his sister, Christine, is not here. Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Bill Foster. Congressman, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jay, and thank you for inviting me here today. Well, let's see. I'll just get right into it here. This is going to be the outline. I'm talking about two main subjects here. The first one is just a little bit of my personal timeline. I have followed the well-trodden path from theatrical stage lighting to high-energy particle physics to the United States Congress. And so I'll be talking a little bit about that. The main subject I want to talk about is what I call the Illinois' payer state problem. And this is a fact that every year between 20 and $40 billion leaves Illinois because we pay a lot more in federal taxes than we get back in federal spending. This is an enormous number, and I believe it is in a large part one of the drivers of all the fiscal difficulties that our state is living through. And so I'll talk about what causes it, and more importantly, what we're in the process of starting to do about it. And then happy to answer your questions. So this is the start of my business career back in the birth of the microprocessor era. This is my younger brother. We started the company when I was 19 and he was 17, and this is our pride and joy, the prototype number 0. The business was started in our basement with $500 from my parents, and then after a little while my dad kicked us out of the basement, and so we moved up to my bedroom, and so this is my bedroom. That's my brother on the lower right. That's me on the middle left with a cute little flip. And you can see on the right my physics textbooks that are growing into disuse as our company gets ramping up. And so we're actually assembling here serial number 1, the first production model from our first paying customer. Our company did a large number of other things along the way. Those of you who have been to Disneyland or Disney World may remember the nighttime electrical parade. That's something that I actually designed and programmed back in the 1980s. And this is the controller, the computerized controller our company built that served backstage to make sure all the light and sound cues and the other things happened on cue for that operation. More recent projects from our company include the 2012 Olympic Stadium in London. The Millennium Park Crown Fountain uses our company's equipment, as does the Lyric Opera. So it's a wonderful company. This is a picture actually from just a couple years ago that showed my brother and me with our first prototype circuit board from over 30 years ago. This is with the factory now in the background. So this is a photograph that shows more than anything the ravages of testosterone on the male hairline. So after running the business for several years, I returned to my first love, which was physics, and the company has been doing very well since then under the very capable hands of my younger brother. And so I went back to Harvard and got my PhD on an experiment that we designed and built to look for proton decay. We created a giant underground cavity, a cube of water, of ultra-pure water the size of a 6-story building, surrounded by thousands of ultra-sensitive light detectors that can see a single photon of light. That's actually that's a diver there diving into the tank. It was in a salt mine underneath Lake Erie near Cleveland, Ohio, a city that has been leading the world in urban decay for years. And so we did not see proton decay, but we did see the neutrinos from a supernova burst. About 160,000 years ago, a star blew up in the Lesser Magellanic Cloud. And for the last 160,000 years, the light from that explosion and the neutrinos from that explosion have been traveling to the Earth. The light was seen in 1987 by the optical astronomers, and the neutrinos were seen simultaneously by our detector. And so we've learned a whole lot about what goes on inside these enormous stellar explosions, where a single star during that explosion will give off more light by a large margin than all the other stars in the galaxy. And so this was actually one of the great and completely unexpected discoveries of my PhD thesis experiment, for which our collaboration got many, many awards. And I then came to Fermilab, where I spent most of my career at Fermi National Accelerator Lab. It's about 40 minutes straight west of here. And if any of you have a half day off, you can go to Fermilab. There's a 15-story high-rise with a walk-through museum on the top, and you can look out over the prairie at the giant accelerators. Yeah, for scale, that's a 15-story building. The circumference of this ring here is a little over 6 kilometers. And so that's what I did for most of my career. We accelerated antiprotons and protons and smashed them together to create particles that had not been seen since the Big Bang. So I came to Fermilab, to work on the experiments and to raise my family. And so this little guy here is now sitting over in the and is a little grumpy at me because I didn't tell him this was a tie operation. But he started out well in life. He started out as with a degree in math and computer science, and was working for a sort of medical imaging and therapy firm for several years, and then tragically told us a few years ago that he was going back to law school. And so he graduated from Harvard Law just a couple years back, and is now an associate at Kirkland Ellis. So it just goes to show that no matter how hard you try to teach your children right from wrong, there's still some chance that they're going to end up as lawyers. And my daughter is also doing wonderfully. She's working for a nonprofit on healthcare in the Indian subcontinent, and is fiancée to a guy that was a year ahead of her at Stanford. So that part of the experiment seems to have come out really, really successfully. The other experiments at Fermilab were also very, very successful. When we collide protons and antiprotons together, you get a spray of subatomic particles, and we analyze that spray to understand what the particles were that we have created that have not been around since the Big Bang. So you need giant detectors to do that. There's a man standing to give scale to the detector that we built there. A lot of the electronics that are visible in that picture were ones that I designed and built, along with a large collaboration. And so we then also had to do the data analysis, and that led to probably Fermilab's greatest discovery, which is called the top quark. It's the heaviest known form of matter, a single subatomic particle that weighs more than an entire atom of gold, and it's probably Fermilab's greatest discovery. After working on the detectors for about 10 years and the data analysis, I then spent the next 10 years working on the accelerators themselves, the giant accelerators that are responsible for creating the collisions. And so this is the accelerators are located in tunnels buried underground that are visible from the surface. And so this is me with one of my collaborators in there. And, all right, so at this point, everyone asked me the same question. Okay, Bill, so you got married, you raised a family, you had a reasonably interesting career in physics and in business. So why on God's green earth did you decide to become involved in politics as it's practiced in the United States? And my response to that is that, I tragically fell prey to my family's recessive gene for adult onset political activism. This is something that runs in our family. In fact, my mother, as I was just discussing with some of you here, my mom actually worked for Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois in his aldermanic office, as well as in his office in D.C. My dad is a civil rights lawyer who wrote a lot of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so, I held off the recessive gene for the first 5 or so decades of my life, and then it got me. And so my dad was actually a chemist. He got a chemistry degree from Stanford, and during World War II designed fire control computers for the Navy. And then most of the way through the war started getting these reports of how many people had been killed by his team's equipment this week. And he became very unhappy with the idea of his technical skills being used to hurt people. And so he'd grown up in the South and saw the nature of the civil rights situation there. And so when he came back from the war, he thought about it for a while and decided to become a civil rights lawyer. And it was actually his struggle with this fundamental decision that we all have to face of what fraction of your life you spend in service to your fellow man. And it doesn't, everyone has to face that, and it turns out science is no good at all in helping you understand that decision. But it was actually reading his papers after he passed away several years ago that I first started thinking about stepping away from my career in science and spending part of my life in service to my fellow man. And so many scientists say, hey, Bill, tell me what it's like in politics. Do you think I have what it takes to become a politician? And so the question I then ask them is say, okay, I tell you what, can you pronounce this word? And if they pronounce this word unionized, then I tell them, okay, they should just stay in science. So anyway, so I decided to run for Congress. That's actually Fermilab. You can see that little circle there. And the district that I raised my family in was originally Dennis Hastert's district, which included Aurora and then went out almost to the Mississippi River. So so I started campaigning against Dennis Hastert. Halfway through the election, he resigned basically to become a lobbyist. And so then that triggered a special election, which I was fortunate enough to win. And so then spent the first 3 years of my career representing the old Illinois 14th District. And this is the Illinois 11th, which has Aurora, Joliet, Naperville, Lisle, Downers Grove, Bolingbrook, Plainfield. And you don't want to get me started about gerrymandering. And so this is on March 8th, 2008, the special election where I was able to take the seat, actually, that had been held by Republicans for generations and win it as a Democrat. It's very common for people to say that, Washington is broken and that no one ever gets along in Washington. And here is my small personal counterexample. This is my swearing-in ceremony with my mother, my brother, a possibly recognizable former Speaker of the House, my son, me, and then my wife and my ex-wife, both strong supporters of my campaign and happy to be there at my swearing-in. So that's my counterexample. Sometimes people get along. I took office in March of 2008, sort of halfway through the financial collapse. There were 18 months at the end of the Bush administration where household net worth dropped by about $1 trillion a month, every single month. The largest destruction of wealth in human history, with the possible exception, I guess, of World War II. And so halfway through that, the financial system broke halfway through that collapse. And so I was on the Financial Services Committee. I was put there really almost by accident because there was an opening, and I came in on a special election. And so I was there when Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Sheila Bair came up and said, hey, you have to commit $700 billion of taxpayer money or the world will come to an end next week. I was there when the big three automakers came to us and said, we are all going to declare bankruptcy, our supplier chain will be gone, every one of them will have their production equipment crated up and sent to China, and we will lose the automobile industry. This sort of thing has happened, and so that I had to face an extremely tough vote there as well. Not many people remember, but at the time that the auto bailout came up for a vote, it was polling, I think, at 31 or 32%. That's roughly 70% of people in the United States thought it was a bad idea to rescue the automobile industry. And had we not done that, I believe we would be buying all of our cars from offshore at this point. So that, important tough votes matter. And there were a large number of people that took tough votes in this time scale, not all of whom have returned to Congress. So next time you see Melissa Bean, thank her. Is that right? Okay. A Roosevelt graduate, it was pointed out. All right, so I was very involved during that time in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill. I ended up being 10 for 10 in getting my amendments into the House-passed version, and roughly 6.5 of these survived the final compromise in the Senate. And that largely, the fact that I was that successful as a freshman was largely due to the fact that Barney Frank sort of understood pretty quickly that I knew what I was talking about. And so that when important things came up, he was willing to make sure they got in. But I'll be leaving, I think this is my last slide on this subject, but the point I want to make is that this was not an accident. Our financial crisis was not an accident, it was a mistake. Other countries that did not deregulate their banking system and get rid of effectively all leverage limits on banks, all capital requirements, did not have the financial crisis. Countries that did not deregulate our primary and secondary mortgage markets did not have a housing bubble that has decapitalized the middle class. And the recovery did not have to happen. The history is full of time periods when there's been a financial panic, no action by government, and that the panic continued down to spiral, for decades and permanently crippled an economy. And so that, anyway, I'm happy to come back and discuss all that in more detail because it matters. This is the main subject of my talk here, which is Illinois' payer-state problem. Then in a nutshell, it's that Illinois pays far more in federal taxes than we get back in federal spending. In a typical year, this causes between $20 and $40 billion to leave Illinois. And so I'd like to talk about what causes this and how do we fix it. And so where we rank, Illinois is consistently in the bottom 3 nationwide in return of federal tax dollars. This has been documented for decades by the Tax Foundation and others. Illinois gets shortchanged both on the tax end, in the federal tax end, and in federal spending, where we pay a lot more in federal taxes than average, and we receive a lot back less than average in federal spending. And it's been going on since at least the 1980s. And so what does this mean for Illinois? Well, first off, underinvestment in education and infrastructure. Fiscal deficits. The economic pain trickles down to the states and to its cities. Increased state taxes are inevitable when you're being shortchanged by tens of billions of dollars every single year. Industrial flight caused by that. And moreover, it drives a false narrative about our Illinois economy. Now, there are a lot of people these days that seem to buy into the idea that our problem is we're not competitive because we have high wages. I do not believe that's the problem. I think the core of the problem in Illinois is simply that we have been being rooked in our dealings with the federal government for decades by a very large amount. Okay, so let's look into some of the details here. First, on the tax side. There are several areas, contributions to the federal budget. There's income tax, payroll taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare, business taxes, excise taxes, estate and gift taxes. And so let's look at how Illinois fares there. Well, it turns out that we pay about $1,500 more per person per year in federal taxes than the average person in the US, okay? And most of it happens actually in all of these areas. Every single one of these we pay more than average. And so it's about $1,500. And then you multiply 1,500 times the 13 million people in Illinois, and you get a number of $19 billion, that was the number in 2013, in extra federal taxes paid by Illinois. And in some ways, as a Democrat, I am in some ways supportive of this because it has to do in part with the fact that we are a high-wage economy and that we have a progressive tax system. And so that part is okay, but then there are lots of little details in the federal tax system that bothers me. And there's a philosophical question that you have to ask yourself is whether or not the role of the federal government should be to redistribute wealth between the states. And this is a very deep question, and you have to think about it for a while before you understand what's fair. But you should at least acknowledge that there is the first part of our problem, it happens on the tax side. Okay, now on the spending side. There are 3 major categories. The first thing is federal contracts and discretionary programs, highway construction, military, national labs, you name it. Then there's federal dollars that are paid directly to the states, mainly to fund public assistance programs like Medicaid, Head Start, community development block grants. And then direct benefits from the federal government paid directly to individuals. These are things like Social Security and Medicare. These are the three major segments. And here, it's a similar story. Illinois receives approximately $1,800 per person per year less in federal spending than the US average. So we're getting it on both ends here. Interestingly, the direct payments to individuals, Medicare and so on, we're about par for the course. Just simply speaking, we tax people progressively, but we distribute benefits sort of per capita, that everyone gets, similar Medicare and other benefits. And so that we're pretty much in line with average. The place that we get killed are the payments to Illinois state government programs and the federal contracts and discretionary spending. And that's getting us by about $1,800 per person per year, which multiplies out in 2013 to $24 billion per year missing from our economy. This is an enormous number. And so the net effect here of $19 billion in taxes that we're getting rooked and $24 billion in spending is $43 billion a year that we're being shortchanged. Compare that, just for amusement's sake, to the total amount of money raised by the Illinois state income tax. The individual income tax raised in 2013, $18 billion. Business income tax, about $4 billion. So $22 billion, roughly half of what we lose from the payer-state effect. And another way to look at that, if Illinois did not have a payer-state problem, if we simply broke even, I'm not talking about turning a profit like other nearby states do, if we just broke even, we could entirely eliminate the state income taxes on individuals and businesses and still be money ahead. So this is a huge number, and we've been ignoring it for too long. Now you ask, okay, who are the payer states and who are the taker states? And it's an interesting map that can be analyzed in many ways. They tend to be mainly the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, the West Coast, and then big states elsewhere. So to some extent, this is a big state, little state problem. To some, it can be analyzed in a number of ways. And I think the most useful one politically is to look at it largely as a big state, little state problem, where the states that are the takers are states that have very high representation in the Senate because they have small numbers of people. And here's just the list of the big payer states. This is the absolute amount that leaves each one of these economies. So the New York, New Jersey, Minnesota, Illinois, California, big states. And the state that does the worst per capita, usually it's neck and neck between Minnesota and New Jersey that loses the most per person from the payer state effect. And so when Chris Christie, during the big hurricane issue where Congress was refusing to vote bailout money for New Jersey, the point that Chris Christie was making quite vociferously is, look, at every single year, we send you guys a lot more money than you send back, and now we need some help, and you're saying no. I'm sure he said it more colorfully than I would. And now, who are the big taker states? Well, there's sort of two classes of them. The first are the ones that are right near Washington, D.C., Maryland and Virginia, although Virginia gets a very large amount of military spending of all kinds, not just D.C. related. And the rest are basically, small states or states south of the Mason-Dixon line. Okay, so the payer-state battle is, you can think of it as a big state versus small state. This also means it's a House versus Senate. Thing. And the 33 small taker states hold 2/3 of the U.S. Senate. The 17 much larger payer states hold 56% of the population and therefore 56% of the seats in the U.S. House. So this is a fight that must take place in the House. And we have to just do a much better job of going into the House with sharp elbows. And so if you think about, okay, just take the lower side of that, $20 billion a year, and ask yourself, what could $20 billion a year do for Illinois? Well, I drive in on the Eisenhower and through the Circle Interchange every time and look at the construction. That's about a $500 million project. So you could have 40 Circle Interchange upgrades every single year. That's a level of infrastructure, missing infrastructure investment. Or 100 high-speed bridges across rivers. Or 200 of the 606 line elevated parks, and so every single year, and this has been going on for decades. Okay, so now what am I doing about this? Well, first and foremost, you have to get together across the aisle to get anything done these days, and so I have joined forces with with Scott Garrett, a very conservative Republican from New Jersey, and we are now the co-chairs of the Pear State Caucus. And so Scott and I agree on approximately nothing except for the fact that the United States should not be in the business of massive redistribution of wealth between the states, at least not on the scale that it's currently happening. Secondly, the first step is also to increase transparency via annual reporting. This is not a completely trivial calculation because a big military spending contract may show up initially as a big contract led in Maryland, but the actual factories are in Ohio and Texas and so on. And so groups like the Tax Foundation have been doing that complex calculation of following the money down to where it's actually spent to find the beneficial owners. Same thing happens on the tax side, where so many corporations are domiciled in Delaware, for example, and you'd think that Delaware pays a huge amount of taxes, and it's sort of a fiction. Anyway, what our legislation does is to have the federal government make an annual report that actually nets out the economic benefit. Second step is just state-level support, grassroots support, and public awareness. And the first step in that was Illinois House Resolution 209 by Representative Natalie Manley, expressing support for the federal legislation, and I understand it passed at least unanimously out of committee, and I think it actually passed all the way through the House, the State House. And then, most importantly, we have to begin chipping away at legislative earmarks and formula that systematically steer money into the taker states. And there are a million examples. I sent my staff to find a few examples, and they came back with an enormous stack of these. What's happened is that there are lots of senators from small taker states. And what they have done is over many years, they've inserted special earmarks, federal programs with formula-driven spending that systematically favor the smaller states. And so one example of this that we got to vote last week on an amendment that Scott and I proposed. It's to strike the funding for something that's called EPSCoR states. That stands for Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. It was started in 1979 as a $1 million program inside the National Science Foundation, and its purpose was to stimulate scientific research at universities in states that they thought did not get their fair share. And it's now grown over to 180 million at several agencies. But because it uses a formula deliberately designed to favor small states, what it is, it's based on the total amount of federal research money you get, not the total per capita amount. Then, for example, Rhode Island, which is a small state, small population, doesn't get much research money as an absolute amount, but gets a very healthy amount per capita. And so you find that there's this whole class of federal set-asides that's available to Brown University in Rhode Island, because it's a small state, that are unavailable to Roosevelt University in Chicago, because we're a big state, or in Illinois, because we're a big state. And so this is a sort of very clever way that the system has been gamed for decades, and we have to just pick this apart one at a time to gradually get some fraction of this $20 billion back. And so Scott and I had a proposal an amendment to the relevant piece of appropriations lending that came very close. A lot of people predict that if we bring it up next year, we're actually going to be able to get rid of this. The states that are designated here are essentially, without exception, states that already get a lot more federal funding than they pay in taxes. Another example that you may have actually heard about this in the news, the small state bias in federal disaster declarations. When you declare a federal disaster, it is based on the amount of property damage from the disaster. That makes sense, but it is actually the amount of property damage divided by the state's population, okay? And so that means the threshold for something declared to be a disaster is directly proportional to the size of the state. And so specifically, if the damage exceeds $1.32 per person in the state, then FEMA will recommend declaring it a disaster. So this means that the exact same event can be declared a federal disaster if it occurs in a small population state, but not if it occurs in a large population state, which is approximately insane. And so this actually happens. This is not a theoretical problem. This happened, for example, in a storm track that went across upstate New York and into Vermont back in 2011. And so there were flooding and millions of dollars in damage in both upstate New York and Vermont. But the Vermont Disaster Assistance, because it's a small population state, there was $1.8 million into 556 approved applicants. The New York disaster assistance was zero because the New York damage was not that large per capita, per person in the state. And this is nuts. And it's the sort of thing that's been rooking states like Illinois and New York. And so there's actually a legislative fix. Illinois has taken the lead, actually, in fixing this disaster form. In the Senate, Senator Durbin and Kirk introduced S. 870. The House companion bill is 1685, introduced by Rodney Davis, with sponsors, co-sponsors from across the aisle. There's no reason why anyone from Illinois should not be fully in favor of fixing the large number of egregious things that steer money out of Illinois. Another one, I guess this is my last one, is just federal highway funding. If you look at the top 10 recipients of federal funding per capita, it's an interesting list. In the top 10 occur Rhode Island and Delaware, West Virginia, and if you look at the bottom, it's, well, not surprisingly, New York. But it's hard to imagine why, as a matter of federal policy, we want to put 10 times more money delivering federal roads to people in Alaska than those in New York. And particularly, what is it about Rhode Island that makes it more meritorious than any other state, aside from the fact that, it probably has more senators than it has actual constituents. But as do many of the... And so this is, we just have to keep our eyes open for these formulas because they were written in the dead of night in Senate committee offices over the last 50 years. Many of these are grandfathered in. If you say, okay, what's the rule today? The rule today is you should get your same fraction of highway spending as you did last time. And that's what the rule is, okay? Without any justification of why last year or the year before was so egregiously out of balance. Anyway, so that's the issue in a nutshell. There is some research that has been done on this for decades. The Tax Foundation has been working on it for a long time. The National Priorities Project has a very good website. All of the raw data on spending is available at usaspending.gov, and the IRS, of course, actually reports on a state-by-state basis. So those of you that like playing with spreadsheets, it's an interesting way to raise your blood pressure. And then the first person I found that actually was making a big issue of this is one of my heroes, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who realized that the programs we had in place were systematically hemorrhaging money out of New York at a rate that was ultimately unsustainable. And so it has always confused me why the roads in Manhattan are so cruddy when the cost per person of providing a lot higher quality roads in Manhattan should be pretty small compared to the cost of delivering federal roads to someone who lives out in the middle of Montana. And so we really have to think very clearly about what the federal purpose is in basically providing large subsidies to states where, for whatever reason, people have chosen not to live in large quantities. It's a real distortion of our economy, and it's one that we have to think. People are very fond of criticizing Japan, because apparently Japan has a lot of the same problem. The legislative map in Japan was drawn after the war. And then after that map was frozen, all the people moved to the cities, but the votes did not follow them. So as a result, all of the rural areas with not many people in Japan are way overrepresented. And this is the reason that Japan has these 4-lane, federally funded highways going to little fishing hamlets where there are 13 elderly people. It causes a misallocation of federal resources when this happens. It's easy to spot in Japan and a little harder when we look in the mirror and see this is a big problem in the US. Anyway, so that's it. Thank you all. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Raise your hand. If you have a question, raise your hand. Obviously, nothing, any science question. I will, of course, interpret if he.
Okay, all right, here you go.
From Dennis. How do you keep your, good question, Dennis. How do you keep your wits about you when a surprising number of your colleagues deny climate change?
Well, there's always scientific uncertainty. It's very hard to explain to the general public that there are no scientific facts. There are only theories that have been verified with a very high statistical confidence. It is entirely possible that if I took this and let go of it, that it would not go to the floor through the force of gravity. But there's pretty good statistical confidence in understanding that's going to be the case. The situation with climate is that you're seeing a set of theories becoming more and more solidly grounded with statistical verification of them. And so that it's, one thing I'm not a fan of is when people say that, X% of scientists say that this is so. That is not, this is not a popularity contest. This is not a poll, driven thing. There was a time when the great majority of scientists thought that Einstein's theory of relativity was obviously crap, because you have to spend a very frustrating evening understanding that, unless you're a bigger, a real genius who just sees it and says, of course. It takes a while to understand as people's scientific theories change. There are parts of it that have absolute scientific certainty. There is no question that if you increase the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, that the infrared radiation leaving the Earth will be reflected back by that higher concentration. That is a scientific fact, and people that don't acknowledge that. The response of the Earth's climate has a lot of unknowns, frankly. If all of that extra heat, which is being absorbed by the Earth, we don't know exactly where it will go. If all of it stays in the atmosphere, then the Earth heats up very rapidly. If a lot of it goes into the deep ocean, the Earth will still heat up, but it will take a lot longer as that heat is distributed over a bigger thermal mass. And so there are real uncertainties that are, to my mind, of the order of factor of 2 in what we're going to be going through. And so another big uncertainty is the way that there may or may not be additional clouds reflecting a heat away from the Earth. If as the Earth warms up, you get a higher fractional cloud cover, that'll be more reflective, and so that less of the sun's energy. So there may be feedback loops in that direction. There may also be positive feedback loops. For example, if the Earth warms up a little bit more, all of a sudden all of the swamps in Siberia that have been frozen for eons will then start venting methane, and we can have a runaway effect. So there are both positive feedback terms and negative feedback terms. And as a result, there is some uncertainty, which I would personally judge to be something like a factor of 2. That still means that we are in grave danger of real environmental harm. If you look at the amount of money that we spend trying to prevent low probability events, we spent more than $1 trillion trying to prevent terrorist attacks, probably money that's mostly, at least partially well spent. And so we spend that much money, and that is a fairly low probability attack problem. And the probability of a real climate problem is probably more than 50% at this point. But the difficulty there is that it is a long time away and uncertain. One of the things I struggle with all the time is that the political incentives are all about getting elected in the next election 2 years from now. And so that causes us not to deal well with problems that are a long time away. Things like how are we ever going to pay off the pension system, things like that, which are long-term problems. And it's actually almost a design failure of democracy, that there's a mismatch between the short-term political incentives and the long-term problems that our country has to deal with. I don't know any solution to that except for very consciously voting for and electing people that think about the long term, despite the fact that it's not in their short-term political best interests. Oh, long answer to a complex question.
That'll be your last long answer, sir.
Okay. All right, just kick me when it...
No, just...
All right.
No.
Well, if you ask me simple questions...
Well, this is going to be very simple, and it goes right along, because long-term, a 6-year term is longer than a 2-year term, right? That's, I think, the scientific data. From Jay Doherty, our leader, why did you not run for U.S. Senate?
Well, look, as many of you know, I thought about it, and in the end, I endorsed Tammy Duckworth, who will be a wonderful U.S. Senator. She will be a great candidate and a great senator. Tammy and I had been talking about it as we were both making our decision. We've been talking regularly with each other, and we both recognized that it was very important for Democrats to be united behind the strongest candidate. And I was very proud to endorse her, and I'm going to be very proud to see her sworn in as our next senator from Illinois.
A few more questions. It'd have been real exciting to see someone trying to moderate that, a debate with him running for Senate, wouldn't it? You would need consecutive translation. All right. The Honorable Bill Hood, formerly with American Airlines, now spending a lot of time traveling the world as an ambassador. What state is the closest in balance between taxing and paying? Putsies and takesies, as we used to say.
Yeah, I'd have to go look at the tables. States move around a lot. One example of that is Florida, which jumps violently from being a payer or a taker state, depending on whether we're having a real estate boom or a real estate bust, for example. There are some, I'd have to go look and see if some are stably near the middle. But they tend to be sort of intermediate states. I think that Indiana is one example of a state that pretty much is neutral, just because I've done that comparison. They don't have this $20 billion a year hemorrhaging out. Some years they win, some years they lose. But yeah, there are these tables here, and if you go, we'll be posting this talk on our website. I believe the talk is also going to be posted on the City Club.
Yep.
And so that there are lots of tables. The references in there have the data.
Janice, your question has already been answered about climate change. Michael Weiser, see, short questions. By the way, Michael, from now on you put an X in the yes box, not a check. The old days that vote wouldn't have counted. It's a few old Chicago pals here. Go ahead, talk about gerrymandering.
All right. Okay, well, look at the worst single thing about gerrymandering is that it lowers the reputation of politics in the minds of the average voter. They don't really know exactly how, but they see these maps and they know somehow they're being disenfranchised. And so this is, this is bad. It is, one of the difficulties, of course, is that if you're gerrymandered into a very safe seat, you don't much care about compromise with the other party. And this is a huge problem. I think I'm very interested. California had two simultaneous reforms that I think have been transformative. They got rid of gerrymandering, which the Supreme Court may or may not let them keep, but assuming that it's kept. The other thing they did is that they changed to a primary system where the top two vote getters advance to the independent of party. And so this is a powerful moderating feature. So if I could have one of those two changes, I'd actually maybe even prefer the second one, to have the top two vote getters advance type primary. Because what that means, if you're an incumbent, your worst nightmare is the person who comes second in the primary is a slightly more moderate version of yourself. Because then you'll split your own party and the other party will vote for the moderate guy. As a result, incumbents from California are always looking for ways to appear moderate because they're worried about an attack from the center. And that's very different. If you have partisan primaries, the only thing you care about very often is an attack in the primary. And you don't care about compromise. And I think that's driving a lot of the difficult politics in the United States. And so, anyway, see, I turned even that simple thing into a long question.
We could talk about that later. Okay, Mary Beth Johnson. By the way, really short questions. Of course, the answer could be take you a couple of minutes. What's the solution to the state's fiscal mess?
Well, there's an interesting calculation you can do with that $20 billion a year that's been going on since the 1980s. Just imagine that we took the $20 billion a year that's been leaving Illinois, instead of redistributing it to the other, the states south of the Mason-Dixon line, that we actually just put that in a savings account at a few percent interest. The net present value of all those contributions would be north of $1.5 trillion today. Okay, that is enough money to have paid off, the pension, 10 times over. And so that, we don't have to, if we simply stopped this, or even got rid of half of the payer-state problem and found a way to divert some fraction of that into actually, over time paying off Illinois' debt and the municipal debt that is really a secondary effect of that as the pain trickles down. I think that is our best shot on this. There's certainly, the whole payer-state, when you look at the numbers there, they provide the intellectual basis for doing, such a correction.
Okay, two more questions, and we may have the person stand up and interpret. Is Don Carpenter, Don, where are you? What's your question? All right,
All
but
right.
what's,
Here, what do you do about passing payer-state through the Senate? Oh, yes. Well, this, you compromise. This happens over and over again. The appropriations bill often look very different coming through the House and the Senate. It doesn't, it's not that far from averaging the two. And so if we, it's an extreme case, if we're able to get the Illinois payer-state number out of a House-passed bill down to 0, and the Senate came up with 20 billion, maybe we could take it down to 10. $10 billion a year would be very welcome in this state. So you're not going to get all of it back. Ultimately, the only real solution to this is to redistrict the United States. Every 100 years, you just draw a new map. I'm not sure how you get that through the. But it's a fundamental problem. It was one of the two historic compromises that were made by the founding fathers that we very often wish we could get back. One of which is the disparate, the famous 3/5 of a person, and the other one is the fact that we have the Senate not on a per capita representation, and that is something that has been hurting our country for a long time, and actually will for a very long time.
we have one more question, and again, I'm not sure about this one. Is it Francine Manlow?
Yeah, Francine Manilow.
Okay, Francine, I'll read it verbatim, okay, and correct my interpretation. Go right ahead. Just, we have strict rules here, but we'll make an exception. Go ahead.
Great American dream. Many of us started with nothing. Speaking on behalf of numerous small businesses, we took risks, we sacrificed, but we had a dream. And some of us have been fortunate enough, after many years, of finally becoming successful. But yet now, we seem to be the bad guys because we're earning this amount of money. So 50% is good enough. Now they want to tax another 2%. Where talk about redistribution of wealth and et cetera. What are your thoughts?
Well, okay. So the question is that basically the vilification of wealthy people who've made it themselves. I mean, I guess you're talking specifically about self-made people. There's a separate question of when you talk about things like the estate tax, whether the children of those already wealthy should be given, the head start that they currently are in our country. But if you just talk about people that made it themselves, I guess I could put myself in that. But the $500 from my parents does not come close to summarizing the advantages I had. I had an education paid for largely by the citizens of Wisconsin. We had a very heavily subsidized education at the University of Wisconsin, where we paid a small fraction of what the real cost of that was. And that was because at the time, the citizens of Wisconsin understood that there was a huge payoff from the societal point of view of subsidizing education. And I had a huge advantage in that I had parents that cared a lot about education, made sure that we did our homework, all this sort of stuff. And so that these are huge advantages that are not, they're not guaranteed. Bill Gates is very fond of saying, okay, I'm a big success, but guess what? If I had been born in Ethiopia, I would not be a success. Much of my success depends on the advantages made by that come from living in an advanced society with an advanced government that gives everyone a hand up. And so that's the part of your taxes that go there, I think, are taxes very well spent. There's a part of that. There's another fundamental question we have to ask, is that what is the base level of economic security that we owe people whose lives do not come out well? And this is something where there's a big, frankly, a partisan difference on this. My sister's middle name is Adlai, so you probably know where I come through on these things. I believe that if your life doesn't come out well, that if the business that you tried, doesn't make it if you're not you're not able to put away large retirement savings, that you still are owed a decent level of dignity in your old age. And that what decent level of dignity means is something that we'll be arguing about forever as we have any redistribution at all in this country. And so it's, I don't believe in vilification, but I also have trouble with people who have made it themselves and ignore all of the infrastructure on which their success has depended and are unwilling to contribute back a healthy fraction of their success back to giving a hand up to others. Okay.
Okay. We're all done. I got some parting gifts.
That's right. And no one even asked me about Iran. Okay.
About what?
Iran.
Oh,
Okay, yeah. Small issue.
yeah. Most people in the city are more concerned about the Blackhawks than Iran. Okay.